I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but preachers have a strange sense of humor. When we met for a lectionary group this week, everybody asked each other, so what are you going to preach on? That's a standing joke. Preachers always do that the week before Easter because we're going to preach on Easter. We do the same thing before Christmas too, and you know, it just never gets old. I don't know, we have this strange sense. What are we going to preach on? Wow. This year it's Mark's version. Kind of short, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
You've not heard before.
Mark's version of the resurrection story is just about as short as his version of Jesus' birth, which is non-existent. It's a little bit longer than that. It's Mary the mother and Salome come to the tomb, and it's empty, except for a young man dressed in white who says, what are you looking for? He's not here. He's been raised. And then they do what? Come on, you were listening. What do the women do? They go back to the disciples and what? No, they don't tell them. They don't say anything. Well, wait a minute. They didn't say anything. See, now, by the time you get to Luke and Matthew, they go and tell the disciples, and the disciples don't believe them, and they go running back to the tomb. And, this morning we shared John's version, and Peter and John had this foot race back to the tomb, and then it's all kinds of stuff going on. But in Mark's gospel, it's just kind of there. Now there is a young man who might be an angel. We're not sure. He's dressed in white, although Mark doesn't really say he's an angel, and Mark does that in other places. So we really don't know who this young man was. Luke Timothy Johnson, who was a professor now at Emory, was at the University of Chicago, wrote a textbook called The Writings of the New Testament that I actually used as a New Testament textbook when I was in seminary, and he's writing about Mark's gospel, and professors even like to get playful now and then. They have strange senses of humor. And he says, there's two places in Mark's gospel where there's an unnamed young man we don't know anything about. And one of those is in this scene where he's in the tomb and says to Mary and Salome that Jesus isn't here, he's been risen. And the other place we see him is in the Garden of Gethsemane when the disciples are scattering. A young man tries to get away from the Roman guards, and they grab his cloak and he runs away naked. And Luke Johnson says, maybe that was Mark. It's the only place he's found anywhere in the Gospels, this young man who just kind of appears in these two places in Mark. And sometimes we get fanciful with our wonderings, but it's an interesting thought, this witness. This other disciple of Christ who is never named as an apostle, but yet becomes one of the greatest apostles, writing the first gospel that laid the foundations for Matthew and Mark and those who would come later. The first one to proclaim in written form that Christ is risen. And that should have been enough. Mark says they come to the tomb. A young man there is seated in the tomb and says, Jesus isn't here. He's risen. What he has promised has come true. End of story. Now, the later gospel writers, that wasn't enough. You know, you got to have some appearances of the risen Christ to the disciples, and, you know, doubting Thomas, and then in John's gospel, you got to eat fish, and, you know, then we go to Jerusalem, they go to Jerusalem, and then he's in Galilee, and then, you know, we got to have lots of more stories because we like those, and we don't like those little short endings. In fact, it's pretty well accepted. In some Bibles you might find some things beyond the 8th verse in Mark, and they're usually in brackets because they're not found in the older Testaments, and they're accounts of Jesus showing himself to people, and then about Christians handling snakes, and, you know, but they're not written anything like Mark, and most scholars say, well, you know, somebody along the line decided that the ending was too short, and so they added some stuff. So they're not considered canonical. Well, there's a good word. Authoritative. They're not considered leading or something. But the other gospel writers, they weren't happy with that little short ending either. They had to keep adding things, other stories to kind of flesh it out. And maybe we wonder why, you know, Mark just kind of left it there. Jesus is risen. Women are terrified. They don't tell anybody. Well, they must have told somebody. Right? Hey, how'd we find out if they didn't tell somebody? Somehow the word got out, didn't it? Somehow the word got out. You know, it usually does. Things have a way of getting known. A lot of politicians haven't figured that one out. They try to hide stuff. There's a whole new TV. Have you seen the new TV show Scandal? There's a whole TV show dedicated to the person trying to cover up stuff that the guys do. The hero is the person that covers up stuff. I know. Maybe I got the promos wrong. I don't know. It just seems like an interesting concept to me. The truth gets out, doesn't it? The truth that Christ is risen. And because of that, we are promised eternal life. We are promised life with that risen Christ forever and ever. But it kind of interested me how that news gets out. Think about it. Maybe, you know, speaking of TV shows, we all, you know how at the end of the season sometimes they have a cliffhanger? Remember Who Shot JR? I'm dating myself. Last year there was this interestingly weird science fiction kind of series called The Event on, and the season ended and there were all kinds of unanswered questions, and they never really resolved anything, and you really wondered what the event was and all that stuff, and then they canceled the series. Which is kind of like Mark's gospel. You know, the women they don't tell anybody. It's got what happens next. And maybe Mark did that on purpose. Maybe Mark just said what he had to say and left the rest of us. Maybe there's a reason why Mark wants that message not spoken by the women to the disciples. I don't know about you, but when do you talk to the television now and then, or the movies? You know, it's like, well, I wonder who did he did it over there. Look over there. Hitchcock was great at that. He would say, there's a bomb under the chair. You know. And maybe that's what Mark wants us to do. Mark says, the young man says to the women, Go and tell everyone the Lord is risen, and they leave terrified and they don't tell anybody. And we're reading that, we go, tell the disciples, tell everybody. Come on, tell them. Maybe Mark wants to leave that up to us. Who is it that's going to tell that the Lord is risen? If not those people that saw the empty tomb, then who is going to tell people that the Lord is risen?